right, now we're awake. Thank you so much. Stories. Hugo was in love. It was young love, all-absorbing, possibly unrequited love, and it made him need to locate himself in time and space with specificity so that his head would not explode into meaninglessness. Hugo is a character in Louise Erdrich's latest novel, The Mighty Red. Erdrich wrote, Hugo cradled his head, hands over his sensitive ears, and stared into deep time. His textbook defined a super eon as spanning billions of years and encompassing more than one era, which were units of millions. There was the Paleozoic era, the Mesozoic era, the Cenozoic era, and all derived from Greek terms for ancient life, middle life, and new life. Millions of years. Periods, the Jurassic or the Quaternary, which we're still in, were also millions. Epochs and ages were thousands. In the face of that, what does it mean to live moment to moment as I am living, he asked himself. Each instant, without knowing if she loves me, seems like a super eon, Hugo thought. Then, when I am with her, time collapses. Kismet herself is a collapsed super eon. Hugo was a pompous thinker. With Kismet, he thought, there is no time. Or perhaps we shoot between epochs on a ghost ship of desire. I don't know, he said out loud. I'm just trying to get this straight. Beneath his feet were boards. So now we hear him trying to orient himself in space after orienting himself in time. So he was getting his grounding in the midst of this overwhelming love. Beneath his feet were boards, beneath the boards a basement dug from a 30-foot deep trench of topsoil and reinforced with common fieldstones, or glacial erratics. In the last decades of the 18th century, a geologist endlessly named Henri Louis Frédéric de Saussure noted boulders of a foreign granite scattered on top of limestone high in the Jura Mountains of Switzerland. Terrain erratique, he called them, using the Latin words erratus and terra to mean ground that has wandered. Ground that has wandered. The term was still used to describe stones left behind by glacial ice. That is my heart, thought Hugo. My heart propelled into place by a massive force and left here, a lonely erratic. Hugo put down his book because tears were leaking. He felt they had pooled in his heart because of being faced with so much meaning. So that is what stories do for us, folks. They locate us in time and space, potentially with so much meaning. Stories help us make meaning out of the human condition and the situations we find ourselves in. Stories explain how we got here, like the creation stories found in a wide variety of religions and cultures, including the scientific story, the Big Bang and evolution. Stories tell us why we are here and what we are supposed to do. Stories help us create the future we desire. Padma Lakshmi wrote about the moth radio hour. I believe in the supreme power of storytelling. It's really the only superpower we humans have. Think about it. The cheetah is faster, the elephant stronger, the eagle can soar much higher than any Olympic pole vaulter. Storytelling is the best thing about being human, and I believe it can change the world. Stories can and do change the world. She continues, our stories tell us who we are, who we were, and who we hope to be. They're how we form our very identity. The stories we carry within us contain our lineage, our hopes, dreams, and pain. They tell, too, of our anxieties about ourselves, the world, and our place in it. Stories are how we keep our collective history alive. Narrative psychologist Dan McCannum claims that storytelling happens in all human cultures. He says typically people who tell good stories are considered special and given status in their community. Stories are fundamental to human adaptation and to building an identity. He says each person, from their teens onward, crafts a story onto their life as they figure out who they are, how they're influenced by their culture, and how they want to shape the world. As teens and young adults, we use stories to test and form our identity as we self-differentiate from our families. In middle age, you define that, I won't. In middle age, we begin thinking about our legacy. What are we leaving behind for future generations? Then as elders, we often reflect back on the whole of our lives in the form of a life review. Stories are always with us, for better or for worse. Today I want to talk about why we tell stories, and to do that, I'll talk about what is a story and what happens when we hear a story. I'll claim that how we tell a story matters. I'll talk about the purpose of story and a little bit about where and how we share stories in this community. So what is a story? A story is a narrative. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. There are characters, there's place and time and detail. There's tension or conflict. Something happens in a story. There's transformation, sometimes resolution, sometimes a lesson learned, a moral to the story, or a message. Well, what happens when we hear a story? Stories affect our brain chemistry. Joe Lazauskas talks about the science of storytelling. He says the human brain lights up with 5 times the normal neural activity when telling or hearing a story. Oxytocin is released in the brain when we hear good stories. Oxytocin, as you know, is the empathy drug, so sharing good stories helps us care about others and build relationships. In the book How to Tell a Story by The Moth, they write, a study led by neuroscientist Uri Hasson found that when a person is listening and comprehending a story, their brain activity begins to couple or align with the brain of the teller. MRI scans of 2 brains, one talking, one listening, showed that the brains began to sync. Where the teller's brain showed activity or lit up, soon after the listener's brain lit up too. Now, one catch is that this only happens when the listener is engaged and comprehending the story. So, in short, they say, if you want to spark another person's brain, your story needs to be good. No pressure, worship associates. Joe says that a good story has 4 elements. 1 is relatability. 2 is novelty, a surprise or something new. 3 is tension. And 4 is fluency. He means like understandability, that you can immerse yourself in the story. If a story is good, it does create empathy. It helps us understand others' experiences. A good story, you feel like you're not alone while you're listening to it. It expands the realm of what's possible, and one could go as far as to say that stories can save lives. Batu Wuri, a Moth storyteller, wrote of her childhood. We left Sierra Leone and were displaced for over 11 years because of the Civil War. My mother, deeply connected to her family, was left figuring the world out without her safe place, her mother, aunts, father, brothers, and extended family to guide her journey as a young mother and wife. She would spend the whole day singing songs or speaking out loud to herself in her native language. She would pull my sisters and me close and tell us about her childhood. We didn't always understand all the details, but seeing our mother light up while telling us stories made us light up too. Her excitement became our excitement, her sorrow, our sorrow, and so on. Telling those stories is what kept my mother alive, kept her heart beating through loss after loss after loss. That is how I came to understand the power of storytelling. So here's where I claim how we tell the story matters. How we tell the story matters because it helps us remember and interpret the past. How we tell the story of what happened to our family matters because it influences our identity and what we believe is possible. How I tell the story of what happened to me or what I did matters because it influences how I view myself and others and the choices I might make today or tomorrow. For example, how a story gets told in the courtroom influences the jury. How a minister tells someone's life story in a eulogy matters because it influences the bereavement process. How you sort through your memories of your loved one who has died matters because however complicated your memories might be, it's a normal part of grieving, and it gives you the agency to choose how you want to remember them in your mind and heart, how you want to tell their story and bring it with you. Former President Jimmy Carter died last week at age 100. In the days following his death, we as a country and as individuals are deciding how to cement his legacy. How we tell his story matters. Do we say that he was a one-term, ineffectual US president who wore wool cardigan sweaters as he called on the American people to sacrifice by turning down their thermostats during the energy crisis? I remember my family turning down our thermostats. Or do we say that he accomplished much as our 39th president by creating the Department of Energy, a national energy policy, signed the SALT II nuclear arms reduction treaty with the Soviet Union, established a relationship with China, and conducted the Camp David peace accord between Egypt and Israel? Do we emphasize that he was a humanitarian, a freelance diplomat after his term as president, and recipient of the 2002 Nobel Peace Prize? Do we say that he was a peanut farmer, that he caused a worldwide eradication of guinea worm disease? Do we say he was a devoted husband of 77 years to the same woman, the longest marriage in the history of the White House? Do we say he was a Habitat for Humanity leader and worker, a nearly lifelong Sunday school teacher, a humble hero who helped protect democracy. Speaking of democracy, how we tell the story about the January 6th storming of the US Capitol matters. It is much on our minds and hearts as the 4th anniversary approaches tomorrow. How do we tell that story? Was it a criminal act or a liberatory act? Was it an insurrection, attempted coup, instigated and encouraged by the sitting president at the time who was in cahoots with white Christian nationalists? Or was it a patriotic act by citizens who would liberate us from government? Or even a day of love? Right? I'm not saying anything new here. You've heard these very different spins on the story, on what happened. Which version we choose to tell and to live forward from matters tremendously. So what is the purpose of story? Story helps us make sense of things that do not make sense. It helps us make meaning, find our purpose in life, our calling, like Nick's story, where he told us how he found his vocation within the story of a play, a movie, which connected to his family, his high school mentors, his job. Stories provide entertainment and fun. They let us escape reality for a while. Stories create shared history. They pass on tradition, help form community, and form identity. Julie Beck, in an article in The Atlantic, wrote, in the realm, of narrative psychology, a person's life story is not a Wikipedia biography of the facts and events of life, but rather the way a person integrates those facts and events internally, picks them apart, and weaves them back together to make meaning. She said that the narrative becomes a form of identity in which the things someone chooses to include in the story, the way they tell it, can both reflect and shape who they are. A life story doesn't just say what happened, it says why it was important, what it means for the person, for who they'll become, and for what happens next. So the purpose of story goes deep. Story can limit or expand imagination. It can exacerbate or heal trauma. It can help us deal with our fears and deal with the unknown. Story can transform suffering. Story gives us something to point to, inspiration, motivation, role models. It creates hope and belonging. My colleague and friend Emily Gage wrote, sometimes just sharing our story and having it be held by others is helpful. Sometimes hearing a story that sounds like yours but with a different ending can give you hope. Sometimes listening to someone whose perspective is totally different opens up new worlds and possibilities. In our religious community, we're shaped by the stories that we encounter. And in our religious community, we create a shared story of who we are and who we may become. So a little bit about where and how we share stories in this community. Most obvious is here during Sunday services with worship associate stories and sermons and time for all ages. We tell and listen to people's stories at many other times too. In meetings, we do our personal check-ins. During social and affinity groups, we catch up on each other's lives. During RE classes, multi-gen activities, adult spiritual development groups like theme circles, UU Wellspring, and study groups where we practice intentional sharing and intentional listening. Our social justice teams and other church program teams meet to work together and share their stories. And when a pastoral care associate visits or calls one of you, they're there to listen to your story. Judith Stone, a founding Moth board member and storyteller, wrote, "Sharing a story is an act of courage and generosity. Thanks to the generosity of storytellers, we listeners are almost always granted the pleasure of simultaneously losing ourselves and finding ourselves in stories. We're restored to compassion and possibility and reconnected to our messy, marvelous, exasperating, and exalted human community. For a while at least, listening to a story, our hearts and minds are open, and that is good practice for after the stories are over." So I wonder, how do you want to tell, excuse me, the story of your life? It's like I haven't talked for a week. How do you want to tell your story? How do you want to talk to each other? How do you want to tell the story of your family or your community? How do you want to tell the story of your country? Do you want to tell these stories in a way that limits or empowers? The choice is ours. It's an important question because how you tell the stories matters. How we listen to stories matter. How our brains sync up with each other and change. That matters. You matter. We matter profoundly. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So let us not only tell a good story in this new year, but let us be a good story together. May it be so.